Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for tabling this bill today. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour débattre du projet de loi.
We're here today to debate Bill C-42, an act to amend the Canadian Business Corporations Act and make consequential and related amendments to other acts. The stated goal of the government for this bill is to protect Canadians against money laundering and financing terrorism, and as well to fight tax evasion and tax avoidance and ensure that Canadians become an attractive place to do business. The Conservatives support the concept of a national public registry of beneficial owners of corporations. This is an important step in fighting money laundering and funding terrorism. The Cullen Commission in British Columbia also called for the creation of this registry. 4 reports highlighted the alarming number of cases of money laundering in my provinces. The Cullen Commission developed 101 recommendations. Recommendation 52 asks provinces to work with its federal partners, as well as provincial and territorial ones, to ensure that by 2023, a whole of Canada registry of corporations be accessible to the public. However, many things could be done to improve this bill and guarantee its effectiveness. For this registry to achieve its stated goals, the Conservatives consider that amendments are needed. First of all, we need to work with provinces and territories to guarantee a whole of Canada registry. Also, use more severe sanctions in the cases of violations and reduce the threshold for investigation.
In Budget 2018, as the Minister noted, the government amended the CBCA to introduce requirements for corporations to maintain a registry of individuals with significant control of a corporation. Significant control is defined as someone owning or controlling at least 25% of a corporation share. Budget 2022 added a requirement that corporations provide their registers to the government every year and to report any new information to the registry within 15 days. Under that change, it requires Corporations Canada, and then under this bill, it would require Corporations Canada to make public some of the information collected under the 2022 reporting requirements. Conservatives have long called for more action to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, so it's good to see this bill tabled in Parliament today. However, as I noted in French, there are many gaps in the legislation, and it is our objective to see some concrete amendments and considerations brought forward to this bill at the committee stage. I want to just take a minute to talk about the impact and history of money laundering. For far too long, Canada has had a reputation as a safe haven for dirty money. Our current laws in place to combat money laundering and the proceeds of crime are internationally perceived as being weak. This has led to a wave of dirty money being laundered in Canada, particularly in my province of British Columbia. Casinos, real estate, businesses, and more have long been used to launder money in BC, and the RCMP, local law enforcement, and FINTRAC, in some cases, have been almost powerless to stop it. When the Panama Papers were leaked in 2016, it was exposed that international criminals have long exploited the gaps in Canada's corporate beneficial ownership regulatory scheme to engage in corrupt conduct through federally, provincially, and territorially administered corporations. Organizations like Transparency International have been calling on Canada to create a public registry of corporate beneficial ownership for a long time. As I noted in French, the Cullen Commission in BC has also called for this registry. Among the recommendations was a pan-Canadian registry to be established in 2023. The Commission's report highlighted how drug dealers utilize numbered corporations to stash death money from the fentanyl trade, to take drug money and put it into the housing market in British Columbia, which has led in some cases to prices being driven up. Maybe had a registry been in place sooner, perhaps a few less drug deals would have been laundered. The money from drug deals would have been laundered and prevented some lives from being saved. So a corporate registry does have a lot of consequences, and that's why our party supports it. Now I'll move just briefly into some of the shortcomings we see in this bill. First is the lack of any requirement of the government to actually seek sharing information agreements with the provinces and territories so that the registry can be effective. The corporate registry will be only as strong as the provinces and territories who opt into it. Without them on board, this registry would only apply to about 5% of corporations in Canada. Thankfully, some provinces and territories have already taken the lead on this front and have been implementing registries since the changes to the CBCA were announced in last year's budget. Without all of them on board, however, criminals will just take their dirty money to the jurisdiction with the least strongest regulations. It is my hope that at committee amendments will be adopted to ensure that the federal government is required to pursue agreements with the provinces and territories on information sharing to ensure the registry is truly pan-Canadian and interoperable. I can note that with many of the registries in place, there's a varying degree of information shared. Many do follow the amendments put forward by the budget 2022, but I still think there's a lot of work we can do to make sure that our registry is comprehensive. Second point, we need to look at strengthening some of the penalties. Parliament needs to consider the registry in the context of the ability of law enforcement to combat the use of illegal funds. The current penalties under the CBCA and the new ones proposed in C42 may be too weak to have the desired effect. We must ensure that corporations are compliant with the rules for the registry to be effective. The government should consider strengthening the penalties and making some offences indictable. Many of the fines could simply now be perceived by some corporations who are using illicit funds as the cost of doing business. Another issue with the penalties is that they do not punish corporations that violate the Act nearly as strongly as they do for individuals. All of the offences that currently exist and those proposed in this bill that apply to corporations are punishable by a fine of, I believe, $5,000. However, the strongest penalty applying to individuals is found under Section 21.4 of the CBCA, and that has a fine not exceeding $200,000 and a term of imprisonment of 6 months, as the Minister also mentioned. So we must ensure that corporations who do not comply with these regulations are held just as accountable as the individuals involved. A $5,000 fine will be chump change for some people under this proposed bill. We need to look also at the threshold for disclosure. The CBCA currently defines significant control under subsection 2.1 as an individual who owns or controls significant number of shares in a corporation, which is defined as 25% or more. This is actually quite a high threshold. Currently, security regulators in Canada, say for example the Ontario Securities Commission, have a set threshold of just 10% for public disclosure requirements. Regardless of where we set the threshold, people will try to avoid reporting by ensuring their ownership or control is slightly below it. There are lots of ways for individuals with significant control to pass by the threshold. However, a lower threshold means less opportunities for criminals to simply slip under the radar. We also need to be cognizant of how this will apply in the context of stacked ownership structures and trusts. It would be wise of this House to consider aligning these regulations with those currently imposed on publicly traded companies by amending this bill to change the threshold to 10% and look at the impact of trusts in very close detail at the committee stage. We also need to, Madam Speaker, look at the functionality of the registry. When it comes to how this registry will work and what information will be made available to the public, this bill is concerningly quiet. This bill does outline in Section 21.3 that the Director shall make available to the public the following information, such as their name, their address for service, if it has been provided to the corporation, their residential address, if their address for service has not been provided to the corporation, the information referred to in paragraph 21.1, and any other prescribed information. The first issue here lies in paragraph E. What exactly does this mean by prescribed information? This needs clarification, as the information made publicly available must keep in mind privacy interests. I will note the minister did partially answer my questions during his debate when he said citizenship would not be required in the registry. But I'll just take a moment to comment on that. What if a foreign an individual in another country that doesn't reside in Canada has a corporation in Canada? Should that information, should citizenship information in the context of a foreign owner of a Canadian corporation apply? Or, as another member in the House of Commons mentioned, what if in the case if there's a stacked corporation and certain shares of a company are owned by an individual in another country, should citizenship information be applied in that context? And in the context of terrorism and money laundering, perhaps it's to our benefit in some cases where citizenship is indeed known. So I look forward at the committee stage to really delving into this in detail, because I think everyone in Canada wants to get this registry right. Everyone in Canada wants to give our law enforcement the tools they need to finally begin combating money laundering. We've seen the impact of it in British Columbia. We've seen the empty condos, and we've seen illicit funds from the drug trade being used through corporations to launder that money. We need to move away from what many people call the Vancouver model and really take action right now. So the commitment of the Conservative Party is to work with the government to ensure that our laws are strengthened, to ensure that there's less lives lost from the drug trade by establishing some form of a beneficial ownership registry. And finally, I'd like to touch upon how the registry will actually function. Again, this bill is very vague here in terms of what are prescribed circumstances. Will law enforcement still be able to access the information of those exempted for the purposes of an investigation? Another issue with the guidelines for the registry are the exemptions that have been put in place. We do know, as the minister mentioned in my comments, in my question, that it wouldn't apply to people 18 years of age or younger, but we need to strengthen the language around exemptions. So in closing, this bill is a good first step, and that is why the Conservatives will be supporting it. However, key oversights, at second reading I'll note, however, key oversights must be addressed during the committee process. We must ensure that the penalties for violating the Act are strong enough, and I'm not certain that summary convictions are strong enough. We must ensure that law enforcement and FINTRAC have the ability to easily access the information they need to track down those laundering money and financing terrorism. We must ensure that corporations who are involved in criminal activities are held just as accountable as individuals. And for the registry to be effective, we must make the participation of provinces and territories a key priority. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the Industry Committee to strengthen this bill and ensure it truly provides transparency to the public and gives law enforcement the tools necessary to track down money launderers and those funding terrorism. More must be done to reduce the risk of corporations being misused for illicit activities such as money laundering and tax evasion.